Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
The following podcast was recorded on the 4th of February 2013. This week, we hear from Noel Jackson at the Centre for Life. Noel asks us, do the public need to understand science?
This is the shortest talk I've ever been asked to do. Do the public need to understand science? Yes. Right, okay, thank you. Seriously, everybody needs to understand science, but different audiences have different needs. And there was a suggestion that I would define the public. And I don't like the term public. I prefer the term audience, because we have lots of different audiences, and even in my job, which is supposedly about formal education, there's lots of different audiences there. Sometimes I'm speaking to sixth formers, sometimes I'm speaking to teachers, sometimes I'm speaking to parents, sometimes I'm speaking to members of the public, and all of those have got different takes on what they want out of it. I think that thinking about it, there are probably 5 audiences. There are those who are going to go on to do science. They need a broad-based science education. And one of the things that I was lucky enough to persuade people at the Centre for Life they had to do was to move away from an obsession at just talking about molecular biology, and to recognise that at the age of 9 or 11 or 13, there isn't actually very much molecular biology there. The entire syllabus for genetics up to Key Stage 3, which is at the age of 14, is you're a bit like your mum and you're a bit like your dad, and the stuff is in the nucleus in the cells, and that's it. If you can remember that, you can pass what used to be called Key Stage 3 SATs. So recognising that there was probably a lot more that could be taught to kids, we expanded it, and particularly at Key Stage 2, which is kids in primary school down, we needed to cover the whole range of sciences. And I've never been a great one for believing in that just because you're a specialist doesn't mean to say that you don't have to have a wide range of knowledge on top of that. So those who go on to do science need a broad base to their science. Those who go on to study the numerate disciplines need practice in handling evidence and numbers. And for those, I really mean everybody who needs a science sort of background to get into university, but not necessarily going to be behaving in a scientific way. And by that I would include sort of people who are working in accountancy or any of those kind of engineering perhaps. Dare I say, many of the medical profession is more of a craft base rather than a science base, or in other words, they're taking other people's evidence rather than generating their own. But they need to understand what they're talking about, and they need practice in handling evidence and handling numbers. Everyone benefits from understanding how things work, the idea about testing, and people who don't understand the idea about trying something and changing it live in a confusing muddle. And there are many poor souls who do live in that confusing muddle, I'm afraid, and I feel desperately sorry for them. And in my role as an educationalist, one of the things I would want to do is lift as many people out of that confusing muddle as possible. Otherwise, when the lights don't work, when your car doesn't start, how do you set about trying to move yourself forward to a better place? Everybody needs to know when they're being bamboozled, and I'm going to come back to this. And the final thing is, and this is something that I haven't heard anybody say, everyone needs to understand the beauty of the great ideas in science. And this came to me when I was doing sort of great stuff as a head of science in a school, and I was finding that there were 2 people who were consistently getting some of the best pupils to go and do their subjects. And one of them was the head of English, and the stuff he was doing was completely pointless, and the other person was the person who was the head of history. Enough said. And I couldn't work out, why are kids going to do that when, you don't need history or English to do anything at all, ever. Once you've got your GCSE in English, that's enough. You don't need a GCSE in history to do anything, not even history. So I couldn't work that one out at all. And the kids were doing it just because they loved the subject. And we've got to remember that science isn't, this utilitarian argument for science is actually a very dangerous one. Because when I was at school, it was, do sciences, lad, you'll get yourself a good job. which was true in those days. But that's not the only reason for doing science. You can do science because it's a very beautiful way of thinking, and to my mind, the most beautiful way of thinking. And I don't think there's enough people who are saying that in education at all. I want to justify science communication professionals as well, because that's what I am. And in this I would include all teachers, lecturers, science communicators, science journalists. They're all specialists, but they're for different audiences. And that's something quite important to recognise. The analogy I would make was that if you are feeling a bit jip and you're not quite sure what the matter is, you wouldn't go to a nephrologist or a neurosurgeon and say, hang on a minute, I'm feeling a bit poorly, what it is. You would want somebody who's got a much broader base to it, and you want the GP. So whilst there are many instances where the ideal person to communicate the science is the person who's doing the fundamental research, there are plenty of other instances where that's not the case. I worry about journalism, and I'm speaking as somebody who comes from a long line of journalists. I'm actually the first scientist in our family, although I'm delighted to say that my two nieces, of the three nieces I have, two have got degrees in chemistry now. Journalists aren't, as a rule, scientifically informed. Does anybody know the name Severino Antinari? Does that ring a bell with anybody? Okay, I'm just taking the measure of my audience here. He was an Italian doctor who claimed in 2009 to have cloned humans. There was quite a big furore about it. He claimed that these humans he'd created from the cells of their fathers was done, that these were 9-year-olds, so the work would have been done in 1999, which is well ahead of the curve for any kind of somatic transfer. And basically he was talking cobblers, and what he was doing is was offering hope to people who had a very large sum of money that they could sort of recreate themselves. He had a massive press conference in London, and the popular press, and indeed the broadsheet press, all lapped onto it. And the wonderful thing about it is that somebody was filming the press conference, not the normal straight ahead view of Antinari talking, but across, and all of the journalists asking the questions. And there's this rabble of about 35 journalists all going bananas because they thought this was a big story. And there's poor old Palab Ghosh from the BBC, who actually is a scientist, who was sitting there and saying, "Excuse me, has anybody got any peer-reviewed evidence?" And he was just like downed in that. That hit the newspapers. I mean, as my boss says, today's news, tomorrow's chip wrappers, but it was quite a big story at the time. And the majority of the press completely failed to ask the relevant questions to see whether this was a story or is it, as it actually was, a complete fabrication. I have a lot of concerns about the press and journalists and the way that they handle science. My particular bugbear is the current measles epidemic, for which I hold the Daily Mail personally responsible, and I'm horrified that they haven't actually been taken to court for it. The Daily Mail jumped on the idea of this study, which was purportedly linking the MMR vaccine with autism in children. The Daily Mail is notorious. It only recognises two classes of chemicals. There are those things which kill you and those things which cure you, and there is nothing in between. So it's either a superfood or a poison. And vaccinating kids with the MMR vaccine was regarded as being very, very nasty. And there was a very, very big response to this, particularly from the middle classes, and kids weren't vaccinated. Now, the thing about vaccination is that people tend to think that you vaccinate to protect the child, and what they fail to see is that you actually vaccinate to protect the population. Because if you have somebody who's infected and they're surrounded by a ring of people who are vaccinated, that infection goes no further. If they're surrounded by a leaky ring, then the infection will spread. But if they're surrounded by a whole population who haven't been vaccinated, then the thing won't spread, it will just go exponential, and then you have an epidemic on your hands. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what happened, and the Daily Mail are the people who are responsible for that initial thing there. So journalists have an enormous responsibility for the health and well-being of this country. And the reason that they did that was that they didn't understand A, their responsibilities, or B, the science involved. TV is another thing which I think is very sad. I know quite a lot of young people who work in TV. More importantly, to their credit, I know a number of people who've been in TV and got out of it. It's full of very, very bright young things. But unfortunately, they have the arrogance that those of you who've been to one of the better universities will sure be aware of in some of your colleagues, where they tend to regard the rest of the world as being a bit stupid when compared with them. And that's a very prevalent attitude amongst people who work in TV. And that's not helpful. The people that plan the programmes, who are sort of last decade's bright young things, are very conservative. It's very difficult to make a television programme that works, and so they'll tend to take a formula that's worked and recycle it. And that's, ladies and gentlemen, accounts for why the majority of your Saturday nights are quite so dull unless you go out somewhere. Another thing which I would point to, how many of you here remember the famous pictures that were appearing in The Sun when we were starting to talk about somatic transfer, loosely called cloning? Remember the Sun headline on that one? No? Oh, it was Wayne Mooney. And what you had was a Cyclops-type picture of... this is when they were bringing in the idea about using cow cells as the sort of the component cell, and then putting in the nucleus from fertilised nucleus from the parents. And that's because of the shortage of human cells available for doing the embryo transfer, and also because of the failure of mitochondrial DNA in some women's cells. And of course they latched onto that and thought immediately that if you do that, then people are going to have some characteristics of cows, and being the Sun, it wouldn't be you would have some characteristics at a cellular level, you would have somebody with a cow's head and the rest of it would be normal. And that's the level of ignorance which A, the Sun journalists had in their own heads, and B, were propagating amongst the population. So there's a lot of need for the press to be much better informed about science. Now, taking those examples, I hope you see that there's an important factor. People need to know more than facts. In fact, the facts aren't really that important to the majority of people. What's important is emotional engagement. And it's the activating factor. Now, emotional engagement is a very difficult thing to gauge. For some people, it might be that they're interested in football, particularly in the north. For some people, it might be a horror of cloning, ideas in their heads about Frankenstein and boys from Brazil, if you can remember that far back. Little kids love sweets. Big kids like explosions. Adults like sex. Music does it for a lot of people, but you have to get the right type of music. Sport for many. Cuddly animals works for a lot. And for the northeast, we are in this wonderful position where actually people will buy into it just because it's Geordie. This isn't science, it's Geordie science. Well, it's got to be all right then, we'll have some of that. And these things are very important. We talk about hooks in the science communication business, and what they are is they're the overlap between what is immediately interesting to the target audience and the subject that we're looking at. And that's the way in. It's the way in through the armour. And then it's up to you there to try and work out your path from the thing which has hooked the imagination. But people say, well, actually, this cloning stuff might be quite interesting, after all. Where do you go to from there? Now, working in the area that I work, you can imagine that I think that possibly the best way to move forward from this overlap where you've got in is stuff which is hands-on. Most people actually work best in what teachers would call kinesthetic learning. Just having some old bloke stand at the front and talk at you is probably the least effective way to pass on information. Now, you lot in here, the fact that you're actually in here listening to some old bloke talk at you indicates that you're a very, very small minority, very fortunate minority. And when you start analysing how people work, there's a myth in education that people are either kinesthetic learners or visual learners or oral learners or musical learners or whatever. And the truth of the matter is that everybody's a kinesthetic learner, and some people are very fortunate in that they have other strings to their bow, and some people who are really, really fortunate have several strings to their bow, and what's more, they can switch between the modes of learning as it becomes the most efficient way to grab the information. And of course, they're the people who are very successful academically and go on and rise up through the system. So, but not everybody has the ability to do that. So if you had to pick one way to engage the largest number of people, the sensible way to do it would be to get people to do something rather than tell them or show them, get them to do it. So we've got this idea about you have to have emotional engagement. It's best if it's done through a practical way. But you can do things like that which are trivial, and it only really, really works when there is some intellectual engagement. It's got to be, people have to think about it, and that effort that's put in gives you a reward. And we talk about hands on, minds on, hearts on. And when you're in that sweet spot where it's all three of those, then the experiences which you generate tend to be the kind of things which people remember for a very long time. And one of the things you might do, and I'll shut up for about 30 seconds to let you do it, is to think about something that happened to you, perhaps quite a long time ago, which you were doing something, and it's something that stuck with you for a very long time. A big memory, a long ago memory. I'm looking round to see who's thinking. Yeah, and obviously if you can generate those kind of experiences, then you get what we call in the education trade deep learning, the kind of stuff that you can't forget. What a brilliant position if you can get a kid to remember a whole bunch of the sort of the basic tenets of whatever it is that you want them to know, and they can actually remember it like that. Then them passing exams, using that information to go on and do experimental work, however they're going to use it, it's there written into the machine going to their heads. I'd like to think that we do it all of the time. Pragmatically, I rather suspect that we don't at the Centre for Life, but we do manage it sometimes. And I have a little anecdote about that. I got a phone call from a lady at a teacher wanted to speak to me about a workshop, and she said, "Hello, this is Angela, and I speak to thousands of people over. I said, God knows who this woman is. Hello, So yes, we came to you last year. Oh, that's lovely. And you remember I bought my year sixes. Yes. How did they do in their SATs? Always a good question to ask a primary school teacher, because they will have done that. Oh, they did very well. She said they got funny questions. Funny thing about that, she said there was a question on the SAT which was on music, and we thought there wasn't going to be a music question on there, so we didn't revise it. And I said, oh, that's a shame. She says, it's all right. They did very well in it. And she says, what's more, I spoke to the year 5 teacher, and she hadn't done it with them at all. So it turns out that this class, the only stuff that had about sound was a single session at the Centre for Life 18 months before the SATs. But the class all got maximum marks on that question because they said it was easy, because every time the question said it was something that we'd done and we knew what the answer was. And that's because there were deep learning experiences, and they'll stay with them. I guess it will stay with them until they're like, a million or something like that. One hopes so. Emotional engagement, though, can be abused. And this is particularly true with products which are aimed at women, particularly cosmetics. I moved to the northeast to work for Procter & Gamble, and I was working in I started off working on what became aerial automatic, and then I moved across into the the skincare and that kind of area. And one of the things that we were very envious of was the oil of Ulay, as it was called in those days, which was a Reckitt and Coleman preparation. And one of the things that you do in the business is you try and work out how much profit your competitors are making on their kind of And the thing is that oil of Ulay went out in a little tiny pot like that, and you were charging sort of like a ridiculous sum of money for it. And they must have been making, sort of something like £20 a pot on that kind of stuff. And it was selling off the shelves ridiculous. So it was a real money spinner. And I'm not surprised that Procter & Gamble actually bought up the brand, because they couldn't afford to let that kind of money spitter sit there and do nothing. And the thing is, there's nothing special in oil of Ulay. Hand creams, moisturisers, they're all pretty basic formulations. And, and you can get as good a result out of something like Boots No. 7 as you can of something that you play. Well, I'm not an expert on this. What's the thing which is supposed to have got C stuff in? Something de mer. Creme de mer, is it? Oh, this is something which they charge you ridiculous sums. Comes in dinky little pots. That's how you know it's brilliant. And they charge you ridiculous sums of money for it. It doesn't, creme de mer or whatever it is, doesn't work any better than Boots No. 7. That's, the formulations are the same, but people will pay very large sums of money for something which holds the promise. And the thing is if you watch the advertising, what they promise is eternal youth. Blokes do it a little bit, hence Grecian 2000. Women do it big time, and you only have to go to Phoenix and go around the smellies counter to see how many people are susceptible to that type of advertising. And it's cruel and unfair, and that's what I mean about people being bamboozled, because what people have done there is the emotional thing about hope. My partner is a scientist and a science teacher, and she still is desperate to get on the diet which is going to make her lose a stone in 3 weeks. And she comes in, she talks about eating different, sort of eating only one type of food at a meal and that kind of thing, not eating carbohydrates. I said, bollocks, it's all about how much you stick in your mouth and how much you run about. That's it, really. But she's sure that somebody somewhere has got the magic formula. Gillian McKeith, need I say any more? A lot to answer for, that woman. And then you've got the doctor in France, the Pierre Ducan diet. He's actually getting his comeuppance at last, as people are suing him for talking rubbish. But we haven't got that happening in the UK. So emotional engagement, some people, unscrupulous people, are selling snake oil still. Politicians desperately need to engage. Now, what I'm not going to do is indulge in any cheap politician backing at this point, because they've all come through the Centre for Life. So I will say one positive thing. Of all of the people who've come through, and that basically includes all of the prime ministers for the past, since I've been there anyway, 11 years, the one who I've got any time for at all is Chris Patten, which surprised me, because he was part of the Thatcher Destroy the North government. And he actually is a highly educated man. He's very interested in what we do at the Centre for Life. He's interested in science, and he's an interesting man to talk to. He's the one politician that I've ever met that I would actually invite to a dinner party, because he would be good value. He was there at the handover of Hong Kong. He's now Chancellor of Oxford University, and he's a civilised man, and I warm to him. The rest of them, well... But they sometimes get hold of the wrong end of the stick, didn't they? Blair, the famous thing with the genetically modified food. And he decided that he was going to go and tell the WI what they should think about genetically modified food. So he went down to the National Congress at the Albert Hall. And the red tomatoes, green tomatoes things you have on the telly, well, they got that from the WI, because all of the delegates there have red cards and green cards. And they vote like that in a show of colour, and then they have to go to division if it's not clear. And Blair goes in and says, okay, right, now, ladies, this is what you should believe. We've had some of our scientists look at this, and genetically modified food, it's all right. And they just basically booed him off the stage and held up red cards. They just wouldn't have it, because he made the mistake about trying to tell the WI what they should think, which wasn't a very good move, because they're a highly organised bunch of people, and we get WI groups, they have science wings. Not everybody's part of those, but they do have science wings, and they try and bring their ladies up to speed on that, and we get them come to the Centre for Life on a fairly regular basis. And they are not to be trifled with, nor patronised, absolutely not to be patronised, because they're not stupid, and they seek deliberately seek out to be informed, and would be lovely if the entire population took the same approach as those ladies did. But unfortunately, they did say to Mr. Blair, and I think that was a victory for common sense. The other famous example of politicians abusing their position and patronising the public, of course, is John Selwyn Gummer when the BSE outbreak happened, and the horrendous picture of him feeding his child burgers. It's a form of child abuse, really, isn't it? Okay. Now, I was very interested in the title, which was "Do the public need to understand science?" Because, of course, public understanding of science has not been in common parlance since 2002. My very first BA conference was in that year, and I was there when Sainsbury said the government was withdrawing all funding for public understanding of science, and it would be for public engagement. Now, people haven't quite come to grips with that in some ways, and what engagement is and what the difference between engagement and understanding has never really been talked through. There are still major committees which argue about what do we mean by public and what do we mean by engagement, rather than actually going on and doing some public engagement. So I think that it opened a can of worms that wasn't there. But the idea that he was trying to put forward is it's no good doing the Gummer thing and telling people the men in white coats say this is okay, don't you worry your little heads about it, just doesn't wash. It's more about people understanding and helping them understand and putting them in a position where they will make a sensible and informed decision. And that's really what the job is at the Centre for Life more widely in public, is not to tell people what to think, but helping them to think. We've been pretty successful on the whole. Going back to stem cells, stem cells are widely accepted in the northeast in a way which isn't true in other areas of Britain. It's got the highest area of acceptance for stem cell work, and that's surely got to come about from the work that's been done on the Centre for Life site, and the university and the Life Science Charity have all played a part in doing that. There's been a number of meetings where there have been members of the public have been able to come in and listen to the people involved in the research, talk about what they're doing and explain why they're doing it, helping allay fears. There have been extremist religious political groups in there who've stood up and said, I don't think you should do this. And it's quite interesting when you go in those meetings, because you'll have somebody like Alison Murdoch stand up and talk about what they're doing, or whoever. And then you get somebody stand up and you say, my faith forbids this from doing that. And you can feel the air in the room change. People's religious sensibilities, we don't like treading on those, which we don't as a public. We're generally quite tolerant of people's religious ideas in the abstract sense. We wouldn't want to. And then you get somebody stand up from a patient group, and they say, when they were talking about producing, doing work on diabetes, using a stem cell line for the test material, and somebody says, I got up this morning, I had to inject myself, I've had to inject myself before lunch, I'm going to have to inject myself before my tea, and tomorrow I'm going to have to inject myself 3 times, and I'm going to have to do the same the day after that. And these people are offering me hope that one day I won't have to inject myself 3 times a day. And then you could feel the audience, the tide of the room just go wow, like that. Because people say, well, I can respect your religion, but jabbing yourself with a needle, that's reality, and I can understand that. And the Northeast has been particularly good about harnessing that, and that's going back to people are pretty good about weighing up what really matters. So when the public understand the position that they're in, the public do tend to make, believe it or not, sensible decisions. And all we need to do is to make sure that they have access to that information, and then the science will flow from that, because people will realise the questions that need to be asked and the questions that need to be answered. And probably the most important thing that we need to get right at the moment is global warming. 70% of the public, and this is the highest area of intellectual knowledge that people have commented on, 70% think that they know enough to have an informed opinion about global warming. And the problem is that there are very few people who can actually tell the difference between weather and climate. So what have we got at the moment? Global warming, because it hasn't snowed since last week. What did we have last week? Global cooling. It's people who think very short term, and what we need to do is that's an area where we absolutely need to start getting people to think properly. And you do need people who are professional engagers to do that. You need the people who are doing the research, but you also need the people who are experts in dealing with the people and working out the right way to engage them. And they're not necessarily the same people in every case. And my final word on this is that Brian Cox, really good at astronomy, but what a disaster when he's coming to do the biological stuff. So it is horses for courses and get the right person in the right place at the right time. I think I'm going to shut up now and then field any questions and encourage people to talk amongst themselves after that. Thank you.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dun City, who host the events.